Next, we're going to Amy.
Hello, can you all hear me? Excellent. Well, firstly, I'd like to say thank you very, very much for having me. I find what you guys are doing totally inspirational. I remember being small and having an idea about why aren't children represented in Parliament and being really annoyed about it. But I would never have had the vision that you guys have had to pull this together. And I think you've really shown remarkable leadership and it's just fantastic. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit more about the kind of local element of this and how the decisions that you guys make and your families make can have an influence on food and how we can try and tackle the climate problem. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what a food system is, then why food is important, why does it actually matter for climate change, what are the physical biological processes going on there, and then finish off talking a bit about how you can contribute to tackling this problem in your day-to-day lives. So thinking about a food system, we've had various definitions of food systems from the other speakers who've been absolutely great. And I think I'd like to actually, if anything, make the definition of a food system even broader. I think in terms of when I think about a food system, it's really a complex web of all the activities that go up to producing the food that we all eat. So that's everything right from how the land that the food is grown in is managed, or whether there's some sort of stewardship scheme over that land, through to the transport, through to how it's harvested. Is it harvested by people? Is it harvested mechanically? Through to how it's transported. Is it put in a ship? Is it flown? Is it dried and moved very slowly? Through to where you buy it, how you buy it, right through to how is it cooked, what happens to it, where is it consumed, who consumes it, and right through to the other end of that process, which is what happens to it as waste. So where does it go after we're finished using it? If we cut out a vegetable and we have spare bits of that vegetable, what happens to that food, and is that important? So that's, when we're talking about food systems, that's what I think about. It's how all of those things interact with each other. And when you change one part of it, that can change whole other bits of it. So a big project that I worked on recently at the University of Cambridge was looking at what happens when we take whole food groups out of our food procurement system. So what happens when we stop serving beef, and what impact does that then have on the butchers that we buy the beef on? And they're not very happy because they don't have anyone to sell the beef to anymore. What impact does that have further downstream on the farmers, who I now have to deal with on a regular basis because they're worried about their industry? So the whole thing is intensely complex. So that's what I think of as a food system. So in terms of where that will be relevant to you guys, probably mostly in terms of how you can make an impact, is really thinking about where you sit in that system and the things that very physically just come into your house and leave your house. So you can think about, where do you get your food from? What's the food that you choose to buy? And what happens to food that you don't use? Okay, so those are the three things I'm probably going to address in a little bit more detail. So really going into the second one of those is, what food do you buy? I'm just going to talk through a little bit more about why does food actually make a difference for climate change? Because I'm sure you'll all have heard lots about eating vegan and vegetarian food, and I've heard that's really important for climate change. But does anyone know why that's the case? Can we have nodding and shaking heads? Anyone understand why? I can see Ellie, who's a second-year geographer, who I hope understands why. I can see other nodding. Okay, I'm going to run through that very briefly though, because I still think it's an interesting thing to talk about. So when you're thinking about growing food, you're always thinking about how much, when you're thinking about producing food, how much nutritional value can we get out of the food that we're growing? Okay, so when you think about growing a plant, it's a relatively efficient way to make food. So if you think about your plant, you put your seed in the soil, water it, you make sure it has the relevant nutrients, and it will transform those nutrients and carbon dioxide in the air into sugars that we can use, or into proteins that we can use. And that process is very efficient. The main thing that facilitates that process is an enzyme in those plants. You might have heard of an enzyme, you might not have done, but it's an extraordinarily efficient little piece of biological machinery that does that. So if we just eat plants, those sugars and proteins go directly into our bodies and we can just process them as sugars and proteins, and that's great. Now, when animals eat those plants, it becomes a little bit less efficient because the animal eats those plants and then it needs to process it and process those sugars and proteins and turn them into sort of sugars and proteins for itself, which it will put on in terms of muscle or fat or wherever in its body. But if you've ever looked at a food chain in school, you'll know that, say, for example, you've got grass at the bottom of the food chain, and then rabbits above that, and then foxes above that. And you'll see pretty obviously in the world that there's loads and loads of grass. There's quite a few rabbits. I went for a walk by the Cherry Hinton Ponds on Sunday, and there were lots and lots of rabbits. And then on top of that, you'll have foxes, and there are even fewer foxes. So what we see from that is actually a lot of grass can only sustain a certain number of rabbits, and that can only sustain a certain number of foxes. So essentially, we're losing biomass at each one of those levels. So a rabbit has to eat a lot of grass in order to sustain itself, and a fox has to eat a lot of rabbits in order to sustain itself. So essentially, eating something from the bottom of the food chain, so vegetables, is a much more efficient way of taking on protein and sugars than eating something from the top of the food chain, so like the fox. Now, talking about grass, people don't eat grass. Does anyone know why people don't eat grass? There's loads of it, it's all over the place. I can see some hands going up. So basically, the reason why people don't eat grass, I'm going to go into some more biological detail, as there seem to be some confident people in here, which is that grass, the main sugar in grass is this molecule called cellulose. And the chemical structure of that is really, really hard to break down. And the only thing that can really break it down is particular types of bacteria. And humans don't have those bacteria in our stomachs. So we can break down all sorts of other vegetables, fine. We can break down leeks or onions or potatoes, that's all fine. But the sugar in this grass, this cellulose, is really hard for us to break down. So animals that do eat grass have to have special organs in their stomachs to break that food down. So say, for example, and we call those animals ruminants. So they have this special thing called a ruminant stomach that has all these bacteria in it. So cows are ruminants, sheep are ruminants. Rabbits actually aren't ruminants, although they do eat a lot of grass, but they have another special organ, which I'm happy to tell you about in questions if that's interesting. And essentially what's going on with this ruminant stomach and these bacteria is the bacteria allow the animals to convert grass into protein for them to put on as muscle. But those bacteria are even more inefficient at doing that than the animals are themselves and produce a byproduct, which is methane. Now, methane is, as you will probably all know, another greenhouse gas, which is actually much worse than carbon dioxide. Even though methane gets broken down in 10 years, whereas carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for a long time. So some people think methane's less of a problem, but it still has this really, really big greenhouse gas warming potential. And cows and sheep, when they're digesting grass, produce a lot of it and they burp it all out. Lots of people think they fart it all out, but it's actually burping that's the problem. So cows and sheep are especially bad because they produce all of this extra methane when they're just converting grass to protein. So when we're thinking about the most efficient ways to get enough food for us to eat, meat is worse than vegetables in general, but then cows and sheep are worse again because they're producing all of this methane on top of that. So when we're thinking about what we buy in terms of food, it's probably a really good idea to, even if you have to eat meat, to really try and avoid cows and sheep. So that's thinking about meat versus vegetables. So the other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was fish. So fish, you could argue.
Another 30 seconds or 60
Another 30 seconds, sorry.
20 minutes of questions.
Brilliant. Okay, so very briefly, fish are great because they are also, in some ways like plants, very, very efficient at putting on weight from just stuff that's floating around in the sea. But there's a big problem because we've harvested them massively. So we need to think about getting fish, buying fish which are the most sustainable and haven't been over harvested. And finally, food waste has been argued that food waste has the same greenhouse gas profile as some countries in the world from the amount of food that we throw away. That's really important to not throw away food as well. And I will finish there, but I can definitely answer more questions.
Okay.
Thank you. We're just going to check with Cairo. I understand you to join us as an expert to help answer questions on sustainable soils, but did you want to make a couple of quick points? Keeping in mind we should have some questions come up soon. No? Okay. You're willing to, oh, go ahead.
I'm willing to, yeah, it's fine, as it suits the seminar.
Okay, to help with any sustainable soils questions, especially.
And now we'll move on to the kind of very quick questions, but we hope you ask detailed questions to our panel. So you can either raise your hand like this, or preferably you will go on to the chat, manage participants, or is it participants for anybody? And then go
click on.
And then click on raise hand. Then that's much easier for us to scour around.
Yeah. So if anyone wants to put their hand up in their video that we can see to ask a question about anything related to climate change, food systems, and agriculture, and we remember to, what should they do before they? Before they ask the question, what should they do? Intro.
Oh, introduction, sorry.
Okay, all right.
Oh, so we have one question from Alex Wallace.
Okay, and a second one from Nia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So I was going to ask, I've seen a lot of conflicting information about whether organic food is good for the environment because it uses kind of naturally occurring pesticides like sulfur and things like that, or whether it's actually worse for the planet because it takes up more space and that's less space that could be used for other things, and that in general, more land has to be cleared, etc., habitats destroyed. So I was just wondering, what's the kind of general opinion on organic food? Is it good? Is it bad? Is there a compromise? Yeah.
Okay. And then we'll take this in like a bunch of three. So, Nia, do you still have a question?
Yes. No. I'll lower my hand.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Okay. My question is, droughts and floods are due to climate change, and climate change is due to drought and floods. So what would someone do to change this?
Okay. And now we're going to Freya for our question.
Oh my gosh! Do pigs also produce methane?
Oh, okay. And now we will ask our panel. So why don't we first go to Ayman Amy. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to answer the first question and the third question. I can give a little opinion on question 2, but I feel like others might be better placed to answer question 2. Okay, so in terms of organic food, I think you really actually got it in one with your question. I thought you explained it really well. But there's this tension between trying to grow as much food as possible on as small a space as possible, which means we can leave loads more space to have forest and beautiful rewilded places and lots of places for all the biodiversity to exist. Versus the flip side of that, which is if we use organic methods, we might have to go the other way, which is to farm much more extensively, so over a much bigger area, because we've chosen not to use, for example, fertilizers and pesticides, which can really damage the environment. I think it's a really challenging tension, and I know a lot of people still have debates at the moment around that. I personally tend to come down on the organic farming isn't as important to me, because I really think that we need to spend a lot more time thinking about biodiversity loss. And currently biodiversity loss is absolutely huge and going through the floor. I used to work on something called the Living Planet Index at London Zoo, which essentially calculated the abundance change in vertebrate animals around the world. And it's declined something like 70% in the last 40 years. It's really